I spent more than 35 years of my life building a logistics empire from the ground up, starting with a single rusted flatbed truck and a mountain of personal debt. Through decades of sleepless nights, ruthless boardroom negotiations, and endless sacrifices, I turned that modest operation into a $300 million empire. When I finally sold the company a few years ago, I realized I had accumulated more wealth than my family could ever spend in 10 lifetimes. But retirement did not bring me the peace I expected. Instead, it brought a suffocating boredom. I did not want to spend my remaining years sitting on a golf course or staring at the waves rolling in from my private lakeside retreat. I needed a reason to wake up early, to keep my mind sharp, and to feel the pulse of the city. So, I quietly kept a silent 51% ownership stake in a premium black car service in downtown Chicago. A few days a week, I put on a tailored dark suit, a classic chauffeur's cap, and I drive. It keeps me grounded, reminds me of where I came from, and, more importantly, it makes me entirely invisible. When you wear a chauffeur's uniform, the wealthy people sitting in the back of your luxury SUV do not see you as a human being. To them, you are just an automated piece of the vehicle, a silent mechanism designed to serve and be ignored. They conduct their multi-million-dollar business deals, argue with their spouses, and reveal their darkest secrets, completely assuming the old man behind the wheel is too deaf, too stupid, or too irrelevant to comprehend their words. On a rainy Tuesday morning, the automated dispatch system assigned me a high-priority VIP pickup in the affluent Gold Coast neighborhood. I pulled my black Cadillac Escalade smoothly up to the curb of an ultra-luxury high-rise building. The doorman, recognizing my vehicle, opened the heavy glass doors, and out walked my 9 o'clock client. To my absolute shock, it was Arthur Vance. I knew exactly who Arthur was, though we had never met in person. My daughter Elizabeth, a brilliant 32-year-old pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon, had recently introduced him to me over a brief, chaotic video call as her new fiancé. Elizabeth is an absolute genius in the operating room, spending 14 hours a day saving the lives of critically ill children. But when it comes to the ruthless, deceptive world of men and money, she has always been painfully, dangerously naive. She possesses a heart far too big for her own good, believing that everyone she meets shares her own pure, selfless intentions. Arthur walked toward my car, holding a designer umbrella. He was a hedge fund manager, or so he claimed, wearing a custom navy pinstripe suit that practically screamed new money. His hair was styled to absolute perfection, not a single strand out of place despite the damp wind. He did not bother to make eye contact with me as I stepped out into the pouring rain to open the rear passenger door for him. He did not offer a polite nod or a simple good morning. He merely tossed a heavy, pretentious Italian leather briefcase onto the pristine leather seats and climbed in, shaking the rainwater from his tailored coat directly onto my custom floor mats without a single second thought. I closed the door, walked back to the driver's side, and climbed in. As I adjusted the rearview mirror, I could see his face clearly in the reflection. He was already typing furiously on his phone, his brow furrowed in deep irritation. I lowered the motorized privacy partition just a fraction of an inch, a subtle habit I had developed over the years to ensure I could hear if a client requested a sudden change of destination. I merged the heavy vehicle into the crawling morning traffic on Lakeshore Drive, the heavy rain blurring the windshield as the commute slowed to a painful crawl of red taillights. Arthur barked from the back seat, his voice dripping with condescension. "Step on it, old man. My time is worth $1,000 a minute, and I do not pay for a luxury service to sit behind a garbage truck. Move this boat." My jaw tightened, and my hands gripped the leather steering wheel. In my younger days, I would have thrown a man like him out onto the wet asphalt without a second thought. I had spent 40 years sitting across mahogany conference tables, crushing arrogant, loud-mouthed executives who thought their wealth gave them the right to treat others like garbage. I knew his type perfectly, men who wore their expensive suits like weapons to compensate for a deep, hollow incompetence. But I swallowed my pride. I was playing a role. I was just a driver. I kept my voice raspy, submissive, and completely different from my normal authoritative tone as I replied, I will do my absolute best to navigate the traffic, sir. Arthur scoffed, rolling his eyes in disgust. Just drive and roll up that partition. I have private calls to make. I reached for the button and activated the motorized glass partition, but I let off the switch a split second early, leaving a tiny, imperceptible gap at the very top, just enough for the audio to carry clearly into the front cabin. I watched him closely in the reflection of the rearview mirror. He pulled a second phone from the inner pocket of his expensive suit. It was not his sleek, corporate smartphone, but a cheap, plastic dark gray burner phone. My veteran business instincts immediately flared with alarm. A legitimate hedge fund manager dealing with multi-million-dollar institutional portfolios does not conduct his daily business on a $20 untraceable burner phone. That is the tool of a desperate man, a man actively hiding his trail from the authorities or creditors. He dialed a rapid sequence of numbers, held the phone to his ear, and let out a harsh, arrogant laugh. "Yeah, it's me," Arthur said, his voice completely changing from the polished, professional tone he used with my daughter into something incredibly sleazy and sharp. "Relax. I told you I have the entire situation under control. The margin call is not going to ruin us. I have a golden goose on the hook, and she is practically begging to be plucked." I kept my foot steady on the gas pedal, weaving smoothly through the rain-slick traffic, but my entire focus was laser-locked on that tiny gap in the glass partition. "I'm telling you, it is a done deal," Arthur continued, leaning back in his seat and rubbing his chin with a smug grin. "She is completely clueless, a total bleeding heart. She spent her entire life in the operating room cutting open kids. She has absolutely no idea how capital gains work, let alone offshore financial restructuring. I just throw around a few complex financial terms, act like I'm protecting her assets, and she signs whatever document I put in front of her." The blood in my veins turned to ice as his words echoed through my earpiece. He was talking about my daughter, my brilliant, kind-hearted Elizabeth. "No, we're moving the wedding up to this weekend." Arthur laughed softly, a sinister, greedy sound that made my stomach twist with violent rage. "I convinced her we do not need a prenuptial agreement. I played the romance card, told her that true love does not need legal protection, and that a contract means we do not trust each other." She melted right there. "I am telling you, it is almost too easy. It is like taking candy from a very rich, very stupid baby." My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. I wanted to slam on the brakes, drag him out of the back seat by his expensive Italian collar, and beat him into the wet pavement until he forgot his own name. But the seasoned corporate executive inside me forced the protective father to step back. If I confronted him now, he would simply deny everything. He would manipulate Elizabeth, spin a web of elaborate lies, and my daughter, blinded by her love and exhaustion, would likely side with him. I would be painted as the paranoid, controlling father trying to ruin her happiness, and she would cut me out of her life forever. I needed absolute, undeniable proof. I needed to let him build his own trap so I could lock him inside it. "What about her family?" the voice on the other end of the line must have asked, because Arthur let out a loud, mocking snort of pure contempt. "Her family? There is no family to worry about," Arthur sneered. "Her mother passed away years ago. Her old man is just some retired, clueless blue-collar fossil living out his days in a modest log cabin by the lake. He is completely out of the picture and doesn't know the first thing about modern finance. By the time that old fool figures out what day of the week it is, the ink will be dry, the marriage will be official, and her $12 million trust fund will be sitting in our accounts in the Caymans. I will bleed her completely dry before she even takes off her wedding dress, and there is absolutely nothing the old man can do to stop it." A heavy, suffocating silence filled the front cabin of the SUV, broken only by the rhythmic, steady thumping of the windshield wipers. He had absolutely no idea that the clueless old fossil he was dismissively mocking was sitting less than 3 feet away from him, driving his car and recording every single word of his confession. "We are approaching your destination, sir," I said over the intercom, my voice perfectly calm, steady, and entirely submissive. "About time," Arthur muttered, hanging up his burner phone and shoving it back into his pocket. I pulled up to the curb of his sleek glass office building, walked around in the rain, and opened his door. He stepped out, ignoring me completely, and walked away without leaving a single dollar for a tip. I watched him disappear through the revolving glass doors, pulled out my own phone, and dialed a number I had not called in over 5 years. The hunt had officially begun. Instead, I drove the black Escalade straight to Chicago Memorial Hospital, my mind racing with a mixture of cold fury and strategic planning. By the time I pulled into the visitor parking deck, the heavy morning rain had settled into a dismal, gray drizzle. I changed out of my chauffeur's jacket, leaving my cap on the passenger seat, and threw on an unremarkable dark trench coat over my white shirt. As I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby, the sterile smell of antiseptic and floor wax hit me, a sharp, painful reminder of the hospital corridors I had paced years ago when my wife was losing her battle with cancer. But I pushed the grief aside. I was here to protect our daughter. I checked the surgical schedule at the reception desk and found that Elizabeth had just completed a grueling 9-hour reconstruction surgery on a young child. I located her in the second-floor cafeteria, sitting alone at a small corner table, staring blankly into a lukewarm cup of black coffee. She was still wearing her blue surgical scrubs, and the dark circles under her eyes looked like deep bruises. She looked so incredibly small, so completely drained of her usual vibrant life, that it broke my heart. I walked over quietly and sat down in the plastic chair across from her. She blinked, startled for a second, before a weak, exhausted smile touched her lips, and she reached across the table to squeeze my hand. She told me it was a wonderful surprise to see me in the middle of the day. I did not return the smile. I did not have the stomach for pleasantries. I leaned forward, keeping my voice extremely low and perfectly steady, and asked her about her trust fund. I asked her directly if she had signed a general power of attorney handing control of her assets over to Arthur. At the exact moment those words left my mouth, her entire physical posture dramatically shifted. The soft, exhausted daughter vanished, replaced by a defensive wall of sudden, sharp irritation. She pulled her hand away from mine, crossed her arms over her chest, and asked me how I could possibly know about her personal financial decisions. I told her I was her father, and that it was my job to protect her, especially when she was making sweeping changes to a $12 million portfolio. Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, her eyes darting toward the cafeteria entrance as if she wished she could escape the conversation. She sighed heavily, rubbing her temples, and told me I was overstepping my boundaries. The words tumbling from her mouth did not sound like my brilliant daughter. They sounded completely rehearsed, like a script she had been carefully fed by a predator. "You are too paranoid, Dad," she said, her voice carrying a sharp edge of frustration. "Arthur is a financial professional. He is just protecting my assets from post-marriage tax hikes. It is far too complex to explain to you right now." I stared at her, the phrase "too complex to explain" echoing in my mind with sickening clarity. I looked at her trembling hands and realized that my decades of protecting her from the harsh realities of the world had left her completely defenseless. I had shielded her from the wolves outside the door, but I had left her with no defense against the wolf she had invited into her own home. I kept my voice perfectly calm and asked her to simply let my old legal team review the documents before the wedding. Elizabeth slammed her hands flat on the plastic table, causing a few nearby nurses to glance over in surprise. She leaned in, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective anger that belonged to Arthur, not her. She told me that I had always been controlling, that I never trusted anyone, and that my outdated way of doing business was insulting to the man she loved. She said Arthur was handling everything perfectly, and that the prenuptial agreement was off the table because true love should not be governed by contracts. Hearing that exact phrase from her lips made me physically sick. It was a flawless, terrifying manipulation. I knew that arguing with her would only cause her to stubbornly dig her heels in deeper, so I softened my expression, lowered my shoulders, and offered a gentle, apologetic nod. I told her I was sorry for interfering and that I only wanted her to be happy. Elizabeth's anger immediately melted back into overwhelming fatigue, and she patted my hand, feeling guilty for raising her voice. She told me I just needed to get to know him better and insisted that I host a welcome dinner for the two of them this coming Friday at my modest lakeside cabin. I agreed to host the dinner, promised to be on my best behavior, and watched her walk back to the surgical ward. The trap was officially set. Friday evening arrived with a chilling, damp breeze coming off the lake. I stood on the weathered wooden porch of my modest cabin, watching the headlights of a sleek silver Porsche cut through the gathering darkness. This cabin was my sanctuary, but it was also a carefully constructed decoy. Over the decades, I had learned that immense wealth attracts parasites just as surely as blood attracts sharks. When Elizabeth started dating in her early 20s, I purchased this unassuming, slightly run-down property at the end of a long dirt road. I used it to filter out the opportunists. If a man could not respect my daughter while believing she came from a humble, working-class background, he did not deserve to be in her life. The Porsche came to a stop, its expensive, low-profile tires crunching loudly against the cheap gravel of my driveway. Arthur stepped out into the crisp air, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the roof of the cabin. He immediately looked down at his polished leather shoes, visibly disgusted by the mud and wet leaves coating the ground. Elizabeth emerged from the passenger side, looking radiant and happy, completely oblivious to the profound disdain radiating from her fiancé. I walked down the creaking wooden steps to greet them, and Elizabeth ran up to hug me tightly. When she turned to introduce Arthur, I extended my calloused hand. He shook it with a weak, dismissive grip, his eyes washing right over me. I waited for a spark of recognition, a moment of panic as he realized I was the chauffeur who drove him every Tuesday morning, but nothing happened. To an arrogant man like him, service workers are completely invisible. He saw the faded flannel shirt and the modest surroundings and immediately assumed I was a nobody. "It is a pleasure to finally meet you, sir," Arthur said, his voice smooth, practiced, and utterly hollow. "Elizabeth has told me so much about this rustic little place of yours. It is very quaint." He used the word quaint, but his tone implied pathetic. I smiled warmly, playing the part of the intimidated, simple senior citizen perfectly. We moved into the small dining room, and I poured him a glass of a $15 bottle of red wine I had purposely bought from the local grocery store. He took a small sip and immediately pressed his lips tightly together, fighting a grimace. "A very robust vintage, Richard," he said, placing the glass back on the table with deliberate care. "Very aggressive on the palate." I suppressed a laugh, my mind wandering to the climate-controlled cellar beneath my actual city residence, filled with $10,000 bottles of imported wine. Throughout the dinner, Arthur dominated the conversation, speaking in long, patronizing monologues about the stock market, using aggressive financial jargon designed to confuse and intimidate me. "I understand you're managing Elizabeth's trust fund now," I said, taking a slow bite of my food. "That sounds like a lot of heavy lifting for a young man preparing for a wedding." Elizabeth shot me a warning glance, but Arthur waved a dismissive hand. "It is nothing I cannot handle, Richard," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The tax laws are shifting, and keeping her assets exposed would be a massive liability. I am streamlining the transition, and you don't need to worry your head about it. I am taking care of your little girl." I nodded slowly, letting my shoulders slump as if I were overwhelmed by his brilliant explanation. The moment Elizabeth stood up and walked into the small kitchen to fetch the dessert, Arthur's warm, loving fiancé persona completely vanished. His smile dropped, his posture stiffened, and he immediately pulled the dark gray burner phone from his jacket pocket. He frantically checked a message, his eyes darting toward the kitchen door. From my angle across the table, I could clearly see the glowing screen, and I burned the international country code and the glowing digits of the phone number into my memory with photographic precision. The pieces of the puzzle were rapidly falling into place, and the next morning, I made a quiet phone call to the general manager of the black car service. I gave a simple, non-negotiable directive. From this day forward, I was to be the exclusive driver for Arthur Vance on every single one of his scheduled routes. By Monday morning, my quiet operation was fully underway. I parked the black Cadillac Escalade outside Arthur's luxury high-rise precisely at 8 o'clock. When he emerged from the lobby, he did not offer a greeting. He simply handed me his heavy leather bag and barked in order to place it carefully in the trunk. As I reached out to take his jacket, my eyes locked onto his left wrist. He was adjusting his cuff, exposing a heavy rose gold watch designed to look like a prestigious Patek Philippe Nautilus. Having collected rare timepieces for decades, I immediately spotted the microscopic flaws. The bezel was a fraction of a millimeter too thick, and the gold lacked the distinct warm luster of the genuine model. It was a high-end replica. In the world of high finance, a man does not wear a fake watch unless he is desperately trying to project a level of wealth he does not possess. Arthur was drowning in debt, and my daughter's $12 million trust fund was the only life raft he could see. I climbed into the driver's seat and eased the vehicle into the morning traffic, keeping the privacy partition cracked open. 10 minutes into the ride, the silence was shattered by the harsh ringing of his burner phone. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw that his face had turned pale, a thin sheen of sweat glistening on his forehead. "I told you I need more time," Arthur hissed into the phone, his voice trembling with raw panic. "You cannot do this right now. The wedding is this weekend, and everything is signed. I have the capital coming." The person on the other end of the line was speaking loudly enough for the aggressive, muffled tone to carry through the gap. "Listen to me," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking. "You cannot issue a margin call today. If you liquidate those positions, the entire fund collapses and I will lose everything. Just give me 72 hours. Where am I supposed to get $10 million by noon? The trust fund transfer takes 3 days to clear after the marriage certificate is filed. I cannot legally access her money until Monday. If you call a margin now, I am dead." I felt a cold, hard satisfaction settle deep in my chest. $10 million was the exact size of the hole he had dug for himself, and he was willing to ruin my daughter's life to save his own skin. After dropping him off at his office, I drove directly to a subterranean parking garage in the financial district to meet Harrison, my old forensic accountant and trusted corporate fixer. Harrison was an absolute apex predator in the financial ecosystem. He did not just balance ledgers, he hunted money across international borders. I handed him a manila envelope containing the burner phone number, the financial terms Arthur had used, and the details of Elizabeth's trust fund. Harrison connected his encrypted tablet to a decryption drive, his fingers flying across the screen. Within minutes, the scrolling lines of code stopped. "You have excellent instincts, Richard," Harrison murmured, turning the screen toward me. "The burner phone is registered to an offshore ghost corporation called Vanguard Horizon Holdings in the Cayman Islands. But here is the red flag. The FBI and the SEC placed a covert monitoring hold on this specific shell company 3 weeks ago for international wire fraud. If Elizabeth signs that power of attorney, she won't just lose her money. She will be legally tied to a federal criminal investigation. Knowing the truth and proving it to a woman blinded by love are two entirely different battles. If I simply handed Elizabeth a dossier of offshore accounts, Arthur would spin a convincing lie, paint himself as the victim, and convince her that I was trying to sabotage her happiness. To break his spell over her, I needed to capture his betrayal in real time, stripped of all his charming smiles. I spent the entire night in a private garage, personally dismantling the motorized privacy partition of my Cadillac. I installed a microscopic high-definition camera lens directly into the polished wood grain trim and embedded military-grade, noise-canceling microphones into the leather upholstery of the rear seats, wiring the entire system to an encrypted digital recorder. The next morning, I parked outside Arthur's high-rise, and when the lobby doors opened, he was not alone. He was accompanied by a tall, striking woman with sharp cheekbones and piercing green eyes. She clung to his arm with a familiarity that made my stomach churn. I opened the door for them, and they climbed into the back, completely ignoring me. As I pulled away from the curb, I activated the hidden recording system. The high-definition camera provided a crystal-clear view of the back seat on a secondary screen disguised as my navigation unit, and their voices piped directly into my earpiece. "Are you absolutely certain the old man bought it?" the woman asked, her voice laced with a cold, cynical tone. Arthur let out a smug chuckle. "Richard is a complete dinosaur, Morgan. He practically thanked me for taking control of the portfolio. The power of attorney goes into full effect the moment the marriage certificate is stamped on Saturday, and we will have full discretionary control over her $12 million. Morgan traced the lapel of his suit jacket with a wicked smile. "And the margin call? Are they going to give us the window we need?" "I bought us the weekend," Arthur replied, leaning back. "Once I have her money, I will wire $10 million to cover the short positions on Monday morning, and the remaining $2 million goes directly into our private Cayman accounts. We will be completely clean and have a massive surplus to disappear with." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning pure white as Morgan laughed, pouring 2 glasses of water from the minibar. "You really are a genius," she murmured. "But what about her? Are you sure you can handle playing the devoted husband all weekend?" Arthur scoffed, his face twisting into a mask of pure contempt. "Elizabeth is the easiest part of this entire operation. She's practically a ghost in her own life, working 14-hour pediatric shifts. She is so obsessed with playing the hero and saving lives that she is completely oblivious to the real world. While she is working herself into a coma at the hospital, we get free reign of her beautiful apartment. It is almost too perfect." A cold, violent fury erupted in my chest. They were mocking her very soul, turning her noble dedication to saving children into a sick joke. I kept the vehicle moving at a perfectly smooth pace, but in my mind, the destruction of Arthur Vance was no longer just a necessity. It was my solemn, unbreakable promise to my daughter. I did not call the local police. They were far too slow and unequipped to handle an international financial conspiracy of this scale. Instead, I activated my own network, contacting a senior federal prosecutor in Washington whose career I had quietly supported decades ago. I transmitted the forensic dossier, the forged documents, the private flight manifest showing that Arthur and Morgan had booked a private jet for 11 o'clock on Saturday night, and the pristine audio recording from my car. The federal authorities immediately went into rapid motion, fast-tracking arrest warrants through an emergency federal judge. By Friday evening, the trap was fully set. The rehearsal dinner at the exclusive Oakfield Country Club was in full swing, a grand room filled with crystal chandeliers, expensive champagne, and 200 high society guests. Arthur stood at the ornate wooden podium, holding a microphone, bathed in a warm golden spotlight. He was delivering a moving, hypocritical toast, calling Elizabeth his savior and his angel, pledging to spend the rest of his life protecting her and building a foundation of absolute trust. Elizabeth sat at the head table, tears of pure joy glittering in her eyes. I pushed the heavy double doors of the banquet hall open with a violent shove, the sharp crack echoing through the silent room. The string quartet stopped playing, and all 200 guests turned to stare as I marched down the center aisle, dressed not in a tuxedo, but in my immaculate black chauffeur's uniform, holding the heavy leather binder of evidence under my arm. Elizabeth stood up, her face turning pale with absolute shock and embarrassment. Arthur stared at me from the podium, his confident smile finally faltering as his eyes locked onto mine. I reached the front of the room, stepped up to the microphone, and plugged a small digital drive into the venue's massive sound system. Before anyone could speak, Arthur's own arrogant voice echoed through the speakers, loudly detailing his plan to steal her trust fund, frame her for federal wire fraud, and flee to the Caribbean with his mistress. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Elizabeth stared at Arthur, her world completely shattering as she listened to the raw, undeniable proof of his betrayal. Before Arthur could even step down from the podium, the side doors of the banquet hall burst open, and a dozen armed FBI agents flooded the room. They swarmed the stage, forced Arthur to his knees, and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists, dragging him out of the building alongside Morgan, who was arrested at her table. Elizabeth collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically as the reality of her narrow escape washed over her. I walked over, knelt beside her, and pulled her into a tight, protective embrace. She wept in my shoulder, whispering apologies over and over again. I held her close, stroked her hair, and whispered that she never had to apologize to me. I had built a fortune to shield her from the cruelty of the world, but in the end, it was the invisible chauffeur who had saved her life. Calmness is strength, patience is power, and a father will always do whatever it takes to protect his family.